Hey, what's up everybody? This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is talk about a couple of the issues I have with the kind of modern day Satanism, or what's called the TST, or the Satanic Temple, which I'll refer to as TST. So I just wanted to talk about this because they've been getting a lot of attention, especially recently after Roe v. Wade and the debate around abortion. And I want to talk a little bit about some of my criticisms of TST's approach to politics as a whole and why I think it's kind of unproductive. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. What's really the point here is I want to give issues with their stance. And I really don't have anything necessarily against them, despite what they say. Believe it or not, nothing of the stuff they're doing is traditionally satanic, child sacrifices. Although I guess they argue that abortion is a religious ritual, and we'll go into the legal precedent of this as child sacrifice, these sorts of things. But yeah, regardless, I think they do play an interesting and maybe even important role in the current debate around the separation of church and state. And I am grateful for some of the issues they raise, and I do think it's kind of goofy, but I think they do raise some interesting points. And to that extent, I mean, I am grateful. I mean, I am I wouldn't say I'm really offended by them, other than I'll show you, I'll explain later about why I think their desire to be offensive ends up being counterproductive. But yeah, I mean, I'm just hoping by discussing these issues, we'll have a deeper and mutual understanding of the underlying cultural issues. And to be honest, I mean, I don't really care about what the TST is doing. It's not really my concern or my business. They can do whatever they want, and it doesn't really offend me or anything. But I do think their approach, if they're willing to listen, is unproductive for a couple of reasons. And that's why I'll be giving what's really more of an internal critique. So let's talk a little bit about what Satanism is. So really what they claim is they're encouraging benevolence and empathy among all people, which is kind of the implication, and also to highlight religious hypocrisy and the encroachment on religious freedom. This is just straight from their website. So a lot of their members say they don't actually believe in a literal Lucifer or hell. Instead, they say Satan is a metaphor for questioning authority and grounding your beliefs in science. This is kind of an odd claim, and we'll talk about this more later. So it's kind of more of a symbolic rejection of religious doctrine. But under this are undertones of sort of religious trauma. A lot of people who are reclaiming their experience, or maybe a poor experience of religion, and sort of, I don't know, trying to reclaim their own autonomy or dignity from this. And really, when you start looking at this, you're like, wow, this is a repackaging of Christian ideas to the historically Christian ideas. And I think the role that they play here maybe is arguing that there are a lot of Christians who have fallen away from these ideas. And if that's part of their critique, or at least in part, you guys aren't living up to this, I would very much share their concern or share their kind of jokey attitude. Why is it that people claiming to have allegiance with Satan are better behaved than many Christians? I think if we take away all the rhetoric and we ask that question, that's a very good question. If this is true, that's a very good question. And TST has upheld this. For instance, they claimed that any of their members that were basically doing any sort of violence against Trump or Trump supporters were going to be sort of excommunicated. I would say, I gained some respect, because I'm like, wow, you guys aren't just haters. You guys are actually upholding these principles that you have. It's just unfortunate that they're sort of co-opting these Christian principles because Christians, literally probably because Christians are failing to uphold these principles themselves. I'm going to be harsh. That's why I think the TST provides a very interesting cultural critique. Yeah, that'd be a fair point. But I do think their overall behavior ends up undermining their point, and we're going to explore why later in this video. So, the three types of issues I want to talk about are legal issues with their precedent, specifically around abortion. Now, I don't really take a stand on the abortion debate, but I do think they're fighting an uphill battle here, and I'll talk about why. A legal definitional issue with their status as a religious organization, and this kind of ties into the legal issues around their precedent for abortion. And then lastly, some moral issues that come from a just sort of internal critique of TST from the beginning. So let's start with these legal issues. What's kind of the point here? This is from the Supreme Court. Now, the TST demands Texas recognize the religious right to perform an abortion post-Roe. This is post-Roe v. Wade, which overturned basically protection to abortion. So now states are deciding. Now, from their website, basically, TST claims that this law violates the Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, in that it legislates a religious viewpoint that prohibits TST's members' ability to perform their religious practices freely. Now, we'll talk about later whether or not TST can legally claim that this is a religious practice. But first, I think we need to identify that claiming you're a religion does not de facto exempt you from the law. In some cases it does, but it's really done on a case-by-case basis, and especially when it involves laws that are really involving around like life or death sort of matters, which arguably abortion is. This would not hold up in a court of law, at least not currently. Maybe they could make a case for it, but they would once again be fighting such an uphill battle. You know, like the use of peyote in Native American religious rituals, this is upheld as a religious practice and done under the free exercise clause. But in many other cases, it doesn't. And as I'm going to argue, based on two court cases, the legal precedent is not in TST's favor. So this was Reynolds v. United States. This is a case in 1879 where the Supreme Court ruled that laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious beliefs and opinion, they may with religious practices. And the example they give, which I think is really pertinent here, is suppose one believed that human sacrifices were a necessary part of religious worship. Would it be seriously contended that civil government under which he lived could not interfere to prevent a sacrifice? So this is really what I think the TST is trying to do, is say, look, abortions are a religious practice. Now, they're not going to use sacrifice because of this particular case, which specifically has a precedent for sacrifice, but perhaps they could do it some other way. And this was actually done in the case of polygamy. They say to permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Government could only exist in name under such circumstances. So they basically, people were trying to argue that polygamy was a constitutional right by the Establishment Clause, and in Reynolds v. United States, the Supreme Court was like, no, you can't have polygamy. We have laws, basically. Now, the extent to which you could argue abortion is a sort of something that would be a religious practice, that's a dubious case, and it's made especially dubious given TST's professed beliefs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The next court case I want to talk about is Davis v. Beeson, which was, they basically upheld their previous decision. This was a case in 1890. And it basically says, it was never intended or supposed that the First Amendment could be invoked as a protection against the legislation for the punishment of acts inimical to the peace, good, order, and morals of society. However free the exercise of religion may be, it must be subordinate to the criminal laws of the country passed with reference to actions regarded by general consent as properly the subjects of punitive legislation. Now, this is an interesting precedent, and I find it very shaky because it appeals to general consent. And general consent's weird because the TST could argue that actually a majority of Americans think that abortion should be legalized under the first trimester. And in that case, perhaps they could make a case here. But it's a little bit more nuanced because while a majority of Americans are fine with abortion on the first trimester, a majority are not fine with abortion in the third trimester. So one of the general issues here is, let's say general consent was to, that lynching minorities was okay. Obviously, this would be an example of tyranny of the majority, and we would expect the court to uphold minority viewpoints in this particular case. And the extent to which religious organizations advocating against abortion or the sort of pro-life are arguing that they're advocating on behalf of the unborn child, and whether this is allowing abortions as a tyranny of the majority, is a very difficult issue, and one that I don't think is easily going to be resolved by these sorts of arguments, which is why I'm arguing that TST is facing an uphill battle. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's difficult. But it is interesting if they could, under the Establishment Clause, argue that they have some religious beliefs. But this gets into the definitional issue, which I'm going to talk about next, right? Is the Satanic Temple actually a religion? And while they do get religious status, I mean, they are granted an IRS 501c3 nonprofit status, so they are considered a religion. The extent to which they're considered a legitimate religion under the Supreme Court is actually very dubious. And brings us to the question, what is religion? This goes into the case US v. Seeger in 1965, which argued that to qualify as a religion, the claimed belief must occupy the same place in the life of the objector as an orthodox belief in God holds in the life of one clearly qualified for exemption. Because the TST members profess that they don't actually believe in a literal Lucifer or hell, this is where you would basically draw the line. You would have to say that, look, because they don't actually believe in the existence of a literal Lucifer or hell, this is not the same as orthodox belief. And as a result, it does not qualify for the exemptions that religious institutions do. Although I think the court has upheld their status as a religion. And I mean, I'm not the person who would spend any energy fighting this, but it is kind of an interesting case. That's why they're kind of an edge case. If they professed an actual belief in Satan, would that give them more legitimacy? I think it absolutely would. But I think they're afraid to do this because of maybe some of the more, they're the public, who generally maybe is more on the fence. If they see them actually advocating for satanic belief legitimately, I think there's going to be more of a problem. So it's a difficult issue. It's a really difficult issue. I think the TST could make a case like secular humanism does, but whether this would qualify under their argument would be nuanced. So secular humanism is generally considered to be a belief system. Now, whether or not they're a religious institution is different. But if they claim we believe in the sanctity of human life, and that is our religious belief, which we hold as an orthodox belief in the same way that religious people hold God as a belief, then you could argue, okay, this potentially would qualify as a religion and would be given certain provisions and protections. And that's probably the best way they would, or the way they would need to go if they were going to make this sort of argument. But to the extent to which they will, I guess we'll see. And then we have some sort of legal or definitional challenges to TST. So the Harvard Law Review says, the black letter rule is clear. Constitutional liberty entailed a right to articulate views on religion, but not a right to commit blasphemy. The offense of maliciously reviling God, which encompassed profane ridicule of Christ. So there are states that have blasphemy laws, these sorts of things. Now, the way, whether these laws are going to continue, how they're going to stay in the future is up for debate. I mean, given the current Supreme Court, we'll see. But basically what they're saying here is the TST may not be even exempted in the first place because they are more blasphemous than they are its own religion. And that's an interesting sort of question. Now, the TST's, one of the justices said the TST's litigation tactics are a disservice and they distract from the significance to an otherwise meaningful constitutional challenge. And I really agree with them on this. And we'll talk about this more in a little bit. But it's like they do bring up some really interesting issues. And I think it's fair for them to do this. But sometimes their tactics end up sort of undermining the point that they're trying to make. So now I want to move on to my internal critique of TST, and let's look at their 7 tenets that they have. And I think all of these are pretty reasonable, at least for me as a Christian, right? One should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. The struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. This, sounds like it comes right from the book of Isaiah. One's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. Now, this gets to be difficult because this doesn't cover necessarily abortion cases, which they use to cover abortion, but the extent to which an unborn child is its own body that gets its own will, that's a difficult question, and one that isn't answerable by just this alone, but perhaps you can make a case. 4, the freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. And we'll talk about this more later, especially the freedom to offend. We'll mention this as part of my internal critique. 5, beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's belief. I totally agree with the second part. This first part I think gets into some thorny epistemic issues, but I would prefer not to talk about this. I think what I would say now just is, many beliefs should be conformed to a good scientific understanding given the state of research and the quality of these beliefs and fitting our beliefs in accordance with the evidence, as Hume would say. But whether or not that scientific understanding of the world upholds their other tenets is its own question, or whether the best scientific understanding of the world implies a sort of moral nihilism that would be in contradiction to many of these tenets is another issue. Number 6, people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. Wow, sounds a lot like what Jesus said in Matthew about forgiveness and resolving issues and disputes you have and righting wrongs that you've done to people, but I guess Satanists can do these things too. And 7, every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. We'll talk about this, and in particular the issue around compassion later. But, I guess if you were to just read these things independent, I think we would all agree with them if we didn't think they had overt Satanist ties. I think most Christians would end up agreeing with many of these things if they didn't realize this came from TST's website, and that would certainly be a funny study if the TST went around asking people, do you agree with these tenets, and then told them after that these were the tenets of the TST. But part of the problem here is the use of Satan is kind of an odd choice. Now let's talk about tenet number 7 first. They say every tenet is a guiding principle, but it's the spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice that should always prevail over written or spoken word. The issue I would take here is it's difficult to make a case for compassion when, as a whole, you are kind of ridiculing another's belief system, or in the case of many Christians, arguably making a mockery out of their belief system, right? It's like, look, we don't even believe this stuff, and we're playing flippantly with these symbols. In many cases, it kind of reeks of some sort of appropriation that doesn't understand the weight or gravity that many Christians see around Satan, and as a result, it's difficult to claim you're advocating for compassion when these actions themselves don't seem to reflect a certain level of compassion by definition. I think that's kind of one of the criticisms I would say is well, this seems to undermine your own methods, seem to undermine your call to compassion. Some people say, look, the blasphemous iconography of Satanism is, for most Satanists, a declaration of personal liberation from traditional theistic institutions and the sometimes arbitrary restrictions they impose on their followers, rather than a calculated insult directed at faithful believers with the intention to offend. But with that being said, one of the spokesperson for the TST, which is Dex, was basically saying, look, blasphemy allegations are not wrong. A lot of our imagery is inherently blasphemous. And I think it's difficult when somebody looks at the TST to say, to what extent are you using this imagery in an ironic way for a specific purpose? And at what point does it cross the line? At what point are you doing too much and you're just kind of being flippant with this? And at what point are you not making many more friends because it's just really playing fast and loose with something that really does have a lot of meaning to many people? One of the things they say is that many of their members belong to the LGBTQ community, and if you combine that with this tenet, right, Satanic Temple's code of guiding principles prioritizes empathy, we'll talk about that, control over one's body, and respect for other people's freedoms, including the freedom to offend. Wonder if the members of the TST would claim to be offended by traditional religious practices, or would uphold or respect certain religious people's freedom to offend members of the LGBTQ community. And if not, then it looks like they're just special pleading. And this is, I think the problem, right? Arguing you're advocating for the freedom to offend means the freedom to be offended by other things. And this is where I think my internal critique would go after them at saying, yes, you're looking at the freedom to offend, yet you claim to be offended by a lot of these other sorts of things. And as a result, is this really moving the conversation forward in any meaningful way? Or are you just kind of this other sort of parallel, right? You don't get to claim you have the moral high ground if you're kind of doing the same thing. And that's where I would say, yes, I think the treatment of many LGBTQ people by many religious people is terrible, and I would denounce it, right? But I would also denounce this idea that we're free to just say whatever we want regardless of the consequences. If it's something that contradicts somebody's deeply held belief, and I would argue that many of these members would have experienced this firsthand, that doesn't give us a right to do that to somebody else, right? And to the extent at which you think that's okay, maybe shows the true intentions or true beliefs. And yeah, here's the thing, right? Dex was saying, look, a lot of us, they're ripping up the Bible at some of these ceremonies, and we're pretty much anybody who's grown up with religious trauma, which is a tremendous number of our members. And as a result, I mean, if you see TST as a reaction to people who've grown up in maybe fundamentalist households or places where they've been mistreated by religion, then it seems obvious where their critique is coming from. But as a result, it's difficult to take them seriously. It's like, look, you guys have religious trauma. Like, what you need is like therapy. It's not you need to like create a thing that is going against traditional religious belief. It's like you had a bad experience with something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your critiques should be applied to religion with such a broad brush. Here's another example, right? Let's say I was in a very abusive relationship with somebody, with a woman or something like that, and I was hit and abused. The solution to this would not be for me to denounce all relationships and go around trying to convince people to fight relationships. My goal would be to get help and find a healthier relationship. And in the same way, if your relationship with church or with God was very negative, I don't think the solution is necessarily to throw it all away and to say this is bad and we should fight it. I think instead it's to join hands with people who also see problems in the way some people are treated and work to solve it, rather than making enemies out of people that otherwise would share many and agree with many of the points that you're trying to make. We'll talk about this more. But once again, maybe that's not the case. Maybe the point is people are hurting so badly from religious trauma that they're not trying to make any rational or high ground statement. They're just reactionary. But in that case, we need to take it on in that context and not in the context of them making, serious claims about the way things ought to be. And I also find that the choice of Satan is an odd one, right? It's probably done as a foil to Christian nationalism, and it certainly is interesting. But claiming that Satan is a metaphor for questioning authority and grounding your beliefs in science is doing two things. The first thing is it's actually making claims about the nature of God, which seem dubious, at least from somebody from a traditional theistic background. But also grounding your beliefs in science is a weird one, considering that Satan is considered like an icon of deception. So, right, I mean, the Satanic Temple says not using science to deceive or otherwise, and yet, traditional depictions of Satan see him as a trickster. So trying to reclaim Satan, which is the wrong word because it's not reclaiming Satan, but rather trying to redefine Satan as this hero is an odd thing, considering all of the history around Satan in the first place. And there's some of these songs that they're teaching children, right? Satan's not an evil guy. He wants you to learn and question why. He wants you to have fun and be yourself. And by the way, there is no hell. It's difficult for me to convince other Christians who maybe aren't as non-reactive as me to not want to take this and be like, oh, what the heck, And I think, honestly, a lot of this comes down to two particular myths that underlie this sort of the TST. And the two myths are this. One is the myth of secularity, which includes the myth of separating religion from morality. The idea that anything can be truly free of any sort of religious influence. The claim that things ought to be free from any sort of religious influence, and the claim that historically they were or have been. I think these are all myths, and somebody who thinks that these things are possible to the extent, I would encourage you to read Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, which makes a really interesting case for the history of secularism as its own kind of thing and as making its own sort of positive claims, just like any religious system would. The other thing, too, is this sort of myth of science versus religion, this idea of, oh, Satan is grounding your beliefs in science. Maybe that implies that, believing in God or Jesus or whatever is not grounding your beliefs in science. To the extent to which that's a claim, I think is just odd, especially because the TST itself is a religion and wants to be recognized as such. But to claim that they're championing grounding your beliefs in science, certainly there are religious organizations that are not encouraging a healthy look at science or a scientific worldview to that extent. But let's not forget that it was in the context of Christianity and Christian countries that modern science arose, and that many of the pioneers of modern day science were Christians. So I don't see this as necessarily a good argument. Now, maybe that's not one of the things they're trying to do, and in which case, perhaps this would not be a myth underlying their worldview. And you could totally poke a hole at me at that, but regardless. So, like I said, I would agree with many of the TST's critiques of Christian nationalism and their critiques at people who claim they're Christians yet don't follow the teachings of Jesus. But does their approach, this is my question, really do anything to help the current culture war? Or is it adding fuel to the fire? Is it just basically doing the same thing that other people are doing, but on the other side? Is it trying to be offensive and trying to be inflammatory, or is it really trying to solve the issue? Maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know, but it's difficult for somebody like me on the outside who like reads their tenets, and I'm like, yeah, like I guess like I agree with a lot of these tenets and a lot of the things they're saying. I agree with some of their conclusions, but not their methodology. And here's part of the other problem too, right? Many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, they see legislature as targeting them and encroaching on their freedoms. They're very sensitive to this, right? And they may even argue, you may even argue, okay, like they see persecution on a hair trigger. And this is honestly like legitimizing their ideas, regardless of whether or not Christians are persecuted in mainstream society. TST's litigation and their behavior is certainly giving legitimacy to their views. Here's a quote of somebody who was associated with the TST. If my enemies are people of a crazy evangelical mindset who want to take my rights away, those are the kind of enemies I'm proud to have. And my question is, why make enemies, and maybe even on purpose, out of other well-intentioned mainstream Christians who would otherwise share many of their concerns about the poor treatment of others, specifically people in the LGBTQ community and otherwise, right? I think this is a huge straw man that even evangelical Christians are necessarily trying to take any sort of like rights away and even justifying these things. It's difficult, right? It's difficult for me to even make a case outside of Christianity to like not see others as your enemies. And this makes it difficult for me to convince other people who are Christians to be compassionate when they're like, well, why should I be compassionate to these people who are obviously trying to make a mockery of us? And I would say because that's what Jesus would have you do. But I don't think I can give people in the TST a reason to be compassionate towards religious people. And that's, I think, one of the big challenges, I would say, is people in the TST claim to have compassion as a goal, but do you have compassion for the religious people? Or do you need a reason to give compassion to those sorts of people? So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this at least articulated a few things. If there are people from the TST watching this video, let me know in the comments. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to have a conversation. Like I said, I don't really have anything against y'all, and I certainly don't mean to be inflammatory or hostile, rather just point out some of my concerns from a Christian perspective. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.